Hey y'all, welcome back to day 3. Just some real quick housekeeping tips for you. Remember that you will have a vocabulary quiz next time you come to class. You also need to make sure that before we take the test that you have watched that video about Toussaint L'Ouverture, the PBS video that I posted on Classroom. So please make sure you get those items taken care of and be ready for that quiz. Let's go ahead and jump right on in to revolutions in Europe. So, as revolutions were going on in Latin America, Europe was undergoing some changes as well. So here are some things for you to keep in mind. There had been monarchies, and the monarchs claimed to have divine right to rule, but they had been overthrown. So then the Congress of Vienna attempted to restore these monarchies as well as the territorial divides that had been in place beforehand. So what they basically wanted to do was go back to the way things had been long ago, and they were kind of successful in that. So for about the next 100 years, there's very little war between different European countries, but that is a totally different story for what was going on within these countries themselves, okay? So remember when the Congress of Vienna met? They had a seating arrangement where conservatives sat together, liberals sat together, and radicals sat together. But what was it about these groups that made them so different? You have 2 columns for each of these groups in your notes. So in one column, I want you to write down who made up these groups. And in the other column, I want you to write down the political philosophies of these groups. So let's start with the conservatives. The conservatives were the noble and wealthy class. And their political philosophy was that the government should be run by their traditional monarchies. They were all for things going back to the way they had been under absolutism. Okay, so they were happy with the way things used to be. The liberals were made up of middle-class business leaders and merchants or business owners, so people who were really impacted by things economically. This group, they definitely wanted parliaments to be elected and to represent the nation's population, which is a great thing, right? We finally got people representing people that they've elected to represent them. But they only wanted landowners and those who were fairly educated to be able to vote for the elected leaders. So not really all-inclusive there. The third group, they were the radicals. They were basically everyone else in society. They wanted major changes to be made and for democracy to be for all of the people, not just the noble or wealthy class. They also believed that governments should have the same ideals as the French Revolution, which were liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, fraternity is just another word for brotherhood, okay? All right, so nationalism. So you already know the definition of nationalism. It is the feeling that people have of being loyal to and proud of their country. But there's more to it than just that. So remember that we're going to be adding to this definition for the rest of the year. Okay, we are going to talk about nationalism in almost every single unit from here on out. So nationalism is also the idea that people's loyalty shouldn't be only to their country, specifically to a king or to an empire, but to the nation of people because they share a culture or a history together. So this is going to make things a little bit more confusing for folks who have a rigid political philosophy, like the conservatives and liberals, because it is no longer about how much money one has or if one is educated, but rather it's more about a shared culture. So there were a few nation states in Europe at this time, but not many. But by 1815, the nation states that were in Europe were England, France, and Spain. Okay, but don't worry, it's not going to be long before there are others as well. Okay, so let's start with Greece. Okay, Greece was the first to win their own independence. On the map, you can see that the Ottoman Empire was quite large. So it's represented by that orange color. Okay, it would include like present day, it's quite large too, as you can see. So it's got parts of Asia. It's got almost all of the borders here of the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, it goes up into here. This is Greece. This is Africa, so it's in the northern part of Africa as well. So some of the present-day countries that it had included would be Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, part of the Ukraine, Serbia, and others as well. So it was due to this nationalist spirit that the Greeks were able to defeat the Ottoman Turks. And in 1821, the Greeks demanded that the Greeks demanded independence, and they revolted. Okay, so Greece had managed to maintain its own history and culture, and people around the world supported the idea of independence. For example, the Russian Orthodox Christians, they felt a connection to and supported the Greek Orthodox Christians. Educated Americans and Europeans, they loved and respected the ancient Greek culture. Think about Aristotle and Socrates, okay? But not everyone was on board with this, such as the powerful governments in Europe. But as support for Greece grew amongst the people, it eventually results in the powerful nations of Europe coming around to help the cause. And so in 1827, there was a battle. Yes. Okay, so in 1827, there was a battle called the Battle of Navarino, okay? And in this battle here, it was during this battle that the Turkish and Egyptian forces were completely destroyed by the Greeks with the help of the Russian, British, and French fleets. Okay, so here's an interesting fact. You don't need to write this down, but the European fleets were hoping that just by showing up, they would be able to intimidate the Ottomans into fleeing. Well, that wasn't the case. Okay, now here's what you do need to make sure you know. The minute that they arrived, that the British and all of these other European and Russian fleets arrived, they were fired upon by the Ottomans, and then they had no choice but to fire back, which led to the Battle of Navarino. Okay, in 1830, France, Great Britain, and Russia, they all signed a treaty in agreement that Greece was in fact an independent kingdom, but here is where things start to fall apart. Okay, so remember the Congress of Vienna? They had met and basically agreed that things should go back to the way that they used to be. They wanted the kings and queens and monarchies to return. Well, the way that they had set things up in Europe at the time, they all began to fall apart here. Okay, so by the 1830s, there were nationalist riots breaking out all over Europe, and liberals and radicals were openly and constantly attacking the conservative governments in place. So, for example, the Belgians, they declared their independence from Dutch control in October of 1830. Italian nationalists, they worked to unite all of Italy. Now, we're going to talk more about that in day 4, but their goal was to have one unified Italy. In the late 1830s, Poles, which this is what you call a Polish person, you call them a Pole, P-O-L-E, Poles had revolted in Warsaw against Russian rule. And it took almost a year for the Russian forces to end this uprising, to squash this rebellion that was going on. So these nationalist movements began to pop up all over Europe. But by the mid to late 1830s, it looked like the conservatives had everything back under control and that things were getting back to normal. But of course, you know that that is not going to last for long. All right, so revolutions of 1848. So the nationalists in these European countries, they don't give up. In 1848, there's a rash of revolutions that occur. There was a bunch of them that occurred. So here's your spoiler, though. They failed to unite. So let's find out what happened. In 1848, ethnic uprisings broke out all over Europe. So do you remember Prince Metternich? We talked about him when we talked about the Congress of Vienna. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Austrian Empire. He was responsible for having the Congress of Vienna in Vienna. And remember that he had 3 goals for the Congress of Vienna. He wanted to surround France with strong countries so France wouldn't become too powerful again. He wanted to restore a balance of power so that no country would become too powerful. And finally, he wanted to put monarchies back in place where Napoleon had swept through and conquered and put in his own family members in power. So that's not anything you need to write down. You should remember that when we talked about the Congress of Vienna originally. So he's not so big on this whole nationalism movement. Okay, so when these uprisings began in Italy, he sent troops in to squash them. Well, eventually there ends up being an uprising in Vienna. And he became the target of angry, everyday citizens and their frustrations. So after an angry mob had clashed with the police in the streets of Vienna, he was forced to resign and he went into exile in England. But there were uprisings elsewhere too, okay? So in Budapest, which is right here, okay, a nationalist leader by the name of Louis Kossuth, he called for a parliament and self-government in the country of Hungary. So this is what he was saying, hey, we need to have this happening. Remember that within the empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire and even the German Confederation. So if you look here on the map, you've got the Austrian Empire here. Here's your Ottoman Empire down here. Remember that this red line represents the German Confederation of States, okay? So even though we have these empires of this confederation, you still have other countries that are that are being ruled or controlled by these empires. So people are upset about that, about being ruled by other people. There was also an uprising here in Prague. The Czech liberal, they were demanding independence, okay? So this happens over and over again all across Europe. Politics were like kind of seesawing back and forth between, okay, the liberals are winning. No, now it's conservative. No, we're back to being liberal. No, we're conservatives again. So within a year, after all of these different revolutions and uprisings, liberals had lost pretty much all of the gains that they had made against the conservatives. And the revolutionaries failed to unite, and by 1849, Europe had pretty much returned back to the way things were before 1848. So governments went back to doing things the way they had always been doing them, okay? Now, there were radicals in France wanting to make a difference and change things in France as well. So in 1830, King Charles X, he thought that he would try to come out of exile and put the absolute monarchy back in place. Well, of course, this is a pretty big deal to the people of France. I mean, they had just gone through the French Revolution seeking a democratic government, wanting to change things. So they certainly did not want to return to the way things had been. The attempt to put the monarchy back in place ended up sparking several riots, and eventually it forced Charles X to flee Britain. He was replaced by Louis Philippe, who was the last king of France, because eventually, after 18 years of ruling France, the French citizens decided that he was no longer what they wanted, and he basically wasn't able to gain the support of the working class. So once again, the monarchy is overturned, and this time there is a republican government that is set up. So this new republican government, the Third Republic, it seems like a great thing, but it pretty much starts to fall apart as soon as it comes together. And here's the problem. The radicals who had wanted political change, they split into two factions or groups. One faction wanted only political reform, and the other wanted not only political reform, but also social and economic reform. So the results were bloody battles in the streets of Paris, which ends up turning everyday French citizens away from the radicals. And because of that, a moderate constitution was written in 1848. And in this constitution, demands were made for a parliament and for a strong president who was elected by the people, okay? So here's a painting of some of the battles that went on in the street. So this leads us to Louis Napoleon. In December of 1848, Louis Napoleon was elected by the French people to be their president. He took on the title of Emperor Napoleon III just 4 years after being elected. And yes, he is related to Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. So most people were okay with him calling himself emperor, and they accepted it with no complaint. They were ready for France to be stable, and they wanted a strong ruler who would hopefully finally bring some peace to France. So Napoleon III, he did lots of great stuff for France, such as building railroads, encouraging industrialization. He also promoted a very ambitious public works program, and because of his policies, employment decreased and France finally began to experience prosperity again. Okay? All right, so that is basically, say hi. Say hi. Hi. So that's basically it for this video. Next video, we're going to look at the unification of Italy. Don't forget to make sure you watch that Toussaint L'Ouverture video, which is posted on Classroom before you take the test, and you'll have a vocab quiz next class. See you then.